So there has been, emissions have increased obviously since industrial revolution and have accelerated since about the 60s and 70s. But then the technological developments have come with co-benefits which actually have resulted in what we would call success stories of humans reducing the impact of natural hazards, as we will see with some numbers here. So now whatever the unintended consequences were in terms of improving lifestyles while having a massive footprint on the environment and other species, biodiversity, etc., and also creating this divide between the rich and poor. What are the success stories? Basically co-benefits, because it was not done in the early part of the 20th century into the late 20th century with the narrative of climate change, even though we knew climate change is happening and we are doing that even from the 1870s. The awareness and the discussions took off only about after the 70s, the Brundtland Conference and the scientists speaking out like Wally Broker in the late 70s and so on. Okay. Success stories: declining impacts from climate disasters. Deaths from natural disasters have steadily declined for the last 100 years despite fast global population growth. The deadliest natural disasters, drought, extreme temperature, floods and storms, caused 25 deaths per 100,000 people in the 1920s compared to 0.33 deaths per 100,000 people in the 2010s. A 98% reduction, okay, from the 1920s to the 2010s. Again, not all meant as protection against climate or climate adaptation, but mostly co-benefits of everything else we did, and there is a uneven impact, as we will see in the next slide. Natural disasters are now at the bottom of the list of causes of death, responsible for 0.20% of all deaths in the 2010s. As a comparison, cardiovascular diseases, the leading causes of mortality, are responsible for 31% of all deaths. Among climate disasters, deaths are due to extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, are the leading cause of mortality, which is at 0.16 per 100,000 people, even though it's unevenly distributed. Overall, that's a very small number, right? I mean, you don't want anybody to die, but then there are residual risks and irreducible risks as well. When accounting for rising wealth and population growth, economic losses due to climate disaster exhibit a modest or no upward trend. Modest or no upward trend at the global level, and this is mostly rich people increasing their exposure by moving closer to the coast or the woods with wildfires and so on and so forth. The contained increase in climate disaster losses is the result of development co-benefits and deliberate investment in risk reduction. So many building technologies, infrastructures, health care, etc., have obviously been deliberately aimed towards reducing risks, like the vaccines that were developed quickly for the pandemic COVID-19 and so on, obviously have acted as co-benefits against climate impacts as well. Dire warnings, again, looking at the other side of the coin: unequal impacts and poverty traps. Adaptation will be particularly challenging for the poor. This is already something we discussed in terms of the frontier analysis and where the low income and emerging economies are in terms of being close to the adaptation frontiers and where they need to be. The bigger question is how the global community will take care of the most vulnerable communities. Loss and damage under the IPCC has been agreed upon recently, but the funding for that is yet to be seen. Climate change has the potential to worsen inequality between and within countries. So the winners and losers are created by climate change globally, but also within a city itself. For example, a heat wave will impact the poor living without air conditioning and other protections, other facilities and access to health care or hydrating centers, etc., very differently than the rich people, even in terms of having to take public transportation on a hot day versus driving in a car with AC and so on. The virtuous cycle between development and resilience has stalled or is at risk in some countries. We should read this. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and some countries in the Middle East and Asia and the Pacific are at particular risk from extreme weather with limited adaptation capacity, which we looked at before. With climate change, some countries may even risk entering a vicious cycle of low economic growth and increasing climate vulnerability that may resemble a poverty trap. To avoid such a vicious cycle, capacity development, large investments, or both may be needed, and external help may be necessary. Many of these efforts overlap with other development needs. For example, enhancing agricultural technologies, improving communications, widening access to electric power, and strengthening coping mechanisms would boost agricultural productivity, welfare, and increase resilience against droughts in sub-Saharan Africa. So we've said two things, that there are success stories in terms of the overall economic growth and GDP growth across the globe, and reduced number of deaths from natural hazards. But then there is this inequality in GDPs and vulnerability to climate change, and remembering that climate change is largely something that's created by the developing world, who got better lives and reduced mortality from natural hazards. How do we normatively consider helping poor countries become resilient to climate change and natural hazards? This is a key question, right? So let's read a bit more about integrating adaptation into the development agenda, because we are really talking about adaptation to climate change becoming part of the fiscal policies and the economic principles needed to make sure this integration happens. So here, integrating adaptation itself into the development agenda. A multi-dimensional, just and efficient development agenda is what we need, and for that, the strong link between development and climate vulnerability suggests that adaptation to climate change should be an integral part of development planning in all countries. So this is what IMF's role is supposed to be in terms of looking on the horizon, assessing economic performances, fiscal policies, and risks coming down the pipe, and then advising countries to maximize the bang for the buck in terms of the resources they have and how to deal with investments in climate change adaptation and other investments in development, because their common objective is to maximize future welfare given the available resources. As governments face many competing needs and often limited fiscal space, they must carefully allocate resources across all possible uses and including adaptation to climate change while considering distributional effects of their programs. How do these investments percolate to protecting the most vulnerable? For example, given society's preference on goals and distributional outcomes, economic theory can help to guide spending allocation in a way that maximizes social welfare. So there are normative issues that can be built in to benefit all. So if you think again about 31% deaths coming from cardiovascular diseases, then climate adaptation has to be balanced with keeping the population healthy, productive, so GDP can grow, development can happen, and bring about natural resilience against hazards as well, right? Cost-benefit analysis is a tool to assess the net contribution of a program to society's welfare based on society's preferences. So society's preferences should consider risk-informed decisions, but also normative values for non-market goods and so on. So cost-benefit analysis aims at measuring all the impacts of a program, including externalities and non-market impacts, and monetizes them using different methods. So there should be the same CBA rules and methods to be used for other development programs, that can be supplied to adaptation programs, right? The same CBA rules and methods used for other development programs can be applied to adaptation programs. All the projects with a positive net present value are not necessarily self-funding, and additional measures may be needed to ensure their financial sustainability. So with evolving risks and non-stationary evolution of extremes, climate hazards, etc., projects that have a net present value are not necessarily self-funding. So you may need to ensure their financial sustainability if they have value for development and co-benefits for all these other things like social welfare. The lack of fiscal space and capacity may prevent some countries from financing all available projects, especially in low-income countries. What do we mean? These constraints also likely limit investments in education, health, and other development goals. Adaptation and other development priorities should be jointly considered, including synergies and trade-offs among different goals. Assuming financing is fully fungible, so you can move it around based on needs and room for managing priorities. Competing programs should be ranked using cost-benefit analysis, and programs with the highest ranking should be financed. Okay, again, there will be normative, analytic, strategic, technical, feasibility questions, economic feasibility questions, cost-benefit questions there in prioritizing. If financing is not fully fungible, the same logic and the same methods can be applied within earmarked financing projects. Finally, by consistently investing in projects with highest returns, governments can maximize the impact of their spending. This is what IMF tries to do in terms of providing advice and lending. This means, for example, saving the largest number of lives, providing access to education to the largest number of children, ensuring that the largest possible number of people are above the poverty line, and boosting long-term growth. Okay, so we'll come back and look at some details about the cost-benefit analysis challenges, especially considering the zero-sum games, limited resources, and the need to continuously track evolving climate risks and vulnerabilities to maximize resilience with the resources, while also making sure development happens, and these other things, non-market goods like education, welfare, human development index, are also tracked, and people are moved from below poverty line to above poverty line, and so on. So lots of priorities, and there are uncertainties in everything, especially in terms of climate risks. There is a lot of noise and sometimes signal being put out about climate change risks and everything being due to climate change, like the heat wave in the Uttar Pradesh in June being made twice as likely by global warming. At a local scale, at a weather scale, how reliable is such an information, and what do we do with this information, and what are the impacts of this information? If somebody is trying to invest in Uttar Pradesh and they hear that heat wave was made twice likely by global warming, are they likely to run away with their investment and go somewhere else? So we have to be careful about the ethical, financial, and other consequences of making claims based on imperfect tools, imperfect knowledge, irreducible uncertainties, and so on. Okay, so lots of difficult questions and challenges there. Okay.